This is the model train display at the new Grain Academy in Pioneer Acres, an agricultural museum in Alberta, Canada. After just over a year of careful planning and hard work, this museum exhibit officially opened up in the summer of 2021. Featuring a collection of agricultural artifacts on display, the Grain Academy tells the story of grain production in Canada, all the way from the early days of the pioneers to the computerized equipment of the modern farmer. The evolution of Canada's agriculture is a fascinating story. While this historic cultivation gallery and the model railway within it may be new to most people, this exhibit is merely a new chapter in a much older story. In order to fully appreciate what the Grain Academy Museum is today, we must first go back to 1981. The original Grain Academy Museum opened on the second floor of the BMO Centre at the Stampede Grounds in Calgary, Alberta. The museum was started in cooperation between the Alberta Wheat Pool, the City of Calgary, and the Canadian Pacific Railway to help the public learn about one of Canada's most important industries. Before the 1980s, there was a major disconnect between the rural farmers and Canada's urban public. In the 1960s, one of Canada's major elevator corporations, the Alberta Wheat Pool, proposed the idea to bridge this knowledge gap and help Calgarians better understand the importance of grain production. The City of Calgary was on board with the idea, and they also managed to get CP Rail involved as a local sponsor. In the 1970s, construction of the Grain Academy Museum began. By 1981, they were open for business. The Grain Academy's biggest tourist draw was a massive HO-scale model railway that took up half of the museum. With the help of narrations and model trains, it told the story of the grain industry's most important link, the railway.
In the year 1812, a group of Scottish settlers planted wheat in the Red River Valley, an area that is now called Manitoba. These hard-working pioneers tilled the soil with shovels and hoes. The first and second crops were failures, but in the third year, the grain matured and the harvest provided food for the family and seed for next year's crop.
There were 4 trains that operated on that layout: a prairie train, a mountain train, and 2 shuttles.
Small towns sprang up by the early 1900s, as the available land in Alberta was almost entirely occupied.
The first part of the story took us across the Canadian prairies, through a small prairie town, between farm fields, and over a not-to-scale representation of the famous Lethbridge Viaduct. Before arriving at a modern grain elevator, where the train paused so the narrator could explain its purpose. This elevator model was scratch-built by G.B. Hall in Calgary, Alberta, and is now in the hands of a private model railroad collection. After the elevator stop, the mountain and prairie trains resumed their journey and ran back to the Calgary Rail Yard, while added sound accompanied the great train race. From Calgary, the prairie train returned behind the scenes, while the mountain train continued onward along the layout.
Every day, 4 to 5 grain trains leave Calgary on the CP line for the West Coast. From Edmonton, trains move west on the CN lines.
There were a total of 5 spiral tunnels on this railroad, 1 in the prairies and 4 in the mountains. These mountains were constructed almost entirely out of plaster, using chicken wire, plastic sheeting, and a plywood skeleton underneath. To clean the track or service the railments, the railway maintainer could almost fully stand up inside each mountain as the track circled around them. Scratch-built wood bridges and snow sheds added some extra interest to the scene. Some were even addressed by the narrator.
The CP line from Calgary to Vancouver now carries the largest tonnage of any line operated by the railway. Snow sheds protect the railroad from snow and rock avalanches. In the future, traffic will increase considerably on CN and CP lines.
The 5th spiral tunnel brought the train to its lowest elevation on the model railway, as it ran through a representation of the Hell's Gate and Thompson Canyons. In the real canyons, CP and CN operate parallel lines here, and have trackage rights on each other's rails and areas to improve traffic flow. The Vancouver Cascadia Terminal was the final destination for the train. The model terminal buildings were constructed by engineering students from a Calgary university. Built using PVC pipes and plexiglass, the students got experience in constructing large-scale models for their course, while the Grain Academy got a basic model of one of the largest grain ports in the world. A massive 7-foot-long grain ship sat behind the terminal. This too was completely scratch-built. A high-mounted mirror made the grain ship easier to see for visitors. The 2 shuttle trains ran at the terminal as well, powered by Atlas GP38s. From Vancouver, the trains all ran behind the scenes as they navigated a maze of tracks back to their starting point, ready to tell the tale of grain all over again. For 38 years, this massive model railway proved to be a staple of the Grain Academy. School field trips were a large part of the museum. These trips were offered mainly to the elementary schools of Calgary and helped kids better understand the agriculture system in Canada. Naturally, the kids were often glued to the train layout for most of the tour. Stampede Week was also a booming time of year for the Grain Academy. As visitors were in so much, the train ran almost non-stop throughout all 10 days. With such a large layout, you were almost guaranteed to see new things with each visit. Other rail-related exhibits also called the Grain Academy home, such as an array of historic photos showing CPR grain trains in action during the early 1990s. Donated to the GA in the early 2000s, this NMRA contest-winning diorama was displayed there as well. This fine model was constructed by Doug Hole and depicts the Alberta Wheat Pool grain facility in Vancouver, circa the early 1900s. In the back corner of the museum sat this architectural model of the CPR's Rogers Pass project. Featuring intricate lighting with an interactive switchboard, this display gave visitors a full look at one of the CPR's major efficiency upgrades. The Rogers Pass project saw the construction of the 9-mile-long Mount Macdonald Tunnel, as well as a series of bridges and other mainline upgrades to improve traffic flow. This major construction feat was completed in 1988 and has been serving the Canadian Pacific's busy mainline ever since. As 2018 rolled around, the Calgary Stampede Board approached the Grain Academy with their plans to heavily upgrade and renovate the BMO Centre. These upgrades would completely reimagine the building as an all-new, modern complex. By this point, the Grain Academy had become essentially an independent entity. The Alberta Wheat Pool ended in 1998 when it merged with the Manitoba Pool to form Agricor. Another merger occurred in 2001 with United Grain Growers, or UGG. This merger ended the Farmers Cooperative Elevators in Canada, and the new company was not tied to the Grain Academy. The city of Calgary had long forgotten about the Grain Academy, as it disappeared into the mass collage that is the many buildings and exhibits that make up Stampede Park. The CPR was only involved with the initial construction and later with the addition of the Rogers Pass display. Beyond its formation in the 1970s and the layout base, CP Rail was not involved with the GA. The Stampede Board promised the Grain Academy a new place within the planned building, a much larger space where they were free to vastly improve the museum. This was great news for the Grain Academy, as many things, especially the railroad, were definitely showing their age. Having been constructed in the 1970s, the model railway utilized older and now outdated layout construction methods. Built out of plywood, plaster, and chicken wire, the display could almost be dubbed industrial grade. One could physically stand on any part of the layout without fear of falling through. The scenery was a product of budget constraints and limited supplies of the times. Most of it was sand, sawdust, dirt, and paint. The mountains were very impressive on account of their size. However, due to the approaching construction deadline at the time, the builders opted to paint sections of them green instead of laying down scenery. All the trees were scratch-built, which in itself would have taken a while to complete. Perhaps the least reliable part of this railway was the computer that controlled it. This machine was from the early 1990s and was running a very outdated program. The whole layout was analog DC and worked in sections. It was split into 5 sections and monitored by the computer and triggered by the trains. As the train passed specific areas called crossovers, it would tell the computer to start the next narration segment.
On the west side of the mountains, the train picks up speed in the comparatively flat delta area of British Columbia.
This all sounds great on paper, but proved otherwise in practice. To keep the train moving, the computer system would suddenly increase or decrease power to the track so the train could climb grades or match up with what was being said. Sometimes that didn't work, and the train either fell behind or ran too far ahead, or didn't move at all. In that case, the system would become confused because it couldn't find the train based on where it should be, often forcing an employee to go find the train and manually move it to the scheduled location to continue the rest of the sequence. Here, the mountain train fails to start back up again after the prairie sequence. The computer's crossover sections were also poorly designed, as when a train hit one, the lead engine would shut off, while the train relied on the second locomotive to continue pushing it to the trigger point, when the leader would kick in again. This was another factor resulting in occasional stalls. The power spikes the system used to help trains on grades could also hinder performance. In some cases, the spikes shorted the boards on the Kato AC 4400s, rendering the engines useless until the railway maintainer could come in and repair them. Fortunately, they had 3 spare engines to call upon when this happened. As the years went on, the computer problems became more and more frequent. A combination of age and improper track installation was the cause of another issue. In 3 of the 5 spiral tunnels, the track had become worn with age. In 2 of them, the rails began to kink, badly. Nails were hammered into the wood they sat on to temporarily fix the issue, but it only worked for a few months. These kinks and worn spots were known to cause derailments and uncoupling on the grades, sending the intermountain cars flying downhill. On a good day, the cars would just stop at the bottom of the grade and become a small challenge for the railway maintainer to rescue. Many cars were not so lucky. Some derailed in the tunnels, sending them plummeting to the concrete floor below. The vast majority of grain cars on the layout were intermountain. Bent roof walks, busted end cages, and lost couplers were frequent repairs for the maintainer. 3 cars were deemed unrepairable and were used as spare parts for the others. On a rare occasion, one of the locomotives would also share in the carnage. On account of these problems, the Grain Academy was understandably looking to the future with optimism. For the new layout, they were tossing around ideas of safety nets in tunnels, more accessible low spots, and even considered switching to an O-scale display. Plans for other sections of the museum were in effect as well, in the form of more interactive and hands-on displays, as well as video clips so tour guides wouldn't be needed as often. Indeed, the new Grain Academy inside the new BMO Center would certainly be amazing. The Stampede Board no longer shared this optimism. In 2019, the Grain Academy was given a year's notice to vacate. They had unknowingly been completely cut from the new BMO Center plan. The Stampede Board didn't see the relevance of a museum about grain production. Even more shocking was there were Stampede Ground employees, including security guards, who had never heard of the Grain Academy, despite them working in or around the BMO Center. It was now abundantly clear that the Grain Academy had become almost entirely forgotten by the very home in which it lived. More interested in 10 days of chuck wagon races and annual expos The BMO Centre had let money cloud their vision and lost sight of the importance that was the story of the industry that helped build Canada. Closing the knowledge gap between the farmers and the urban public was no longer priority number one for the Grain Academy. Their new priority was to find a new home, which proved increasingly difficult. They consulted other places around Calgary, such as Heritage Park and the Glenbow Museum. Both declined the offer. The Telespark Centre was also a thought, but they preferred temporary exhibits. The looming threat of fading away and being forgotten, as their collection was split up and sold off, never to be seen again, was growing as days, weeks, and months flew past. There were already people interested in sections of the museum. Olds College wanted some of the artifacts, while Calgary model railroaders had their eyes on the trains. Agriculture historians wanted the vintage farm implements. Two small rural museums were interested in the cutaway grain elevators and the extensive photograph collection. The possibility of an auction to sell off the collection and separate from the Stampede Board once and for all appeared to be a more and more reasonable option, but it would mean the end of the museum forever. In a final, perhaps desperate attempt to keep the history alive, the Grain Academy reached out to museums outside of Calgary. Pioneer Acres, an agricultural museum just outside the small Alberta town of Irricana, was one of these contacts. Pioneer Acres mostly specializes in vintage farm equipment such as tractors and trucks. But seeing as they are run almost entirely by a board of experienced farmers, the offer to add a grain exhibit was quite appealing. They had the room and accepted the offer. All that was left was for the Grain Academy curator to inspect its new home before closing the deal. Before long, the offer was accepted, and the Grain Academy was safe. The next part of this story would see the construction of the new Grain Academy and its brand new model railway.